We're here today with Mr. Al Gunther, a longtime DeLand resident, Lake County cowboy, blacksmith, scientist, teacher, and principal during the tumultuous 60s, the changes in education, and also we'll throw in that he's a consummate fisherman. Al, good morning.
Good morning,
We just
Stan.
want to hear what it was like living in DeLand back. You've been here your whole life pretty much.
I've never lived in another town in my entire life.
Well, you know, you were a child you were born in 1935? You were a child in the Depression and World War II. Tell us about your early life, what it was like living in DeLand during that time. Was it hard in the Depression, etc.?
We didn't have a frame of reference on what is hard and what is not hard, but what we did have is we had the life that we had, and we dealt with that the best way we could. Now, my beginnings were closely associated with my granddaddy. He lived at 123 West Howry. His name was Albert J. Gunther, and he was a blacksmith. And our home on 123 West Howry, his home, had 3 stories. It had an attic, had a second story, first 4, and then it had a basement at the bottom. And in the bottom of his home, he had a pet. And that pet was 14 feet long. He was trapped by my granddaddy. My granddaddy went down into a gator cave, wrapped a rope around this gator's mouth, dragged him out of that gator cave, put him in a rowboat, hauled him across Lake Beersford. The gator almost beat the boat apart when he was coming across there. And as a result of that, he finally got him in the back of a truck and brought him to his house. And when I was a little boy, about 3 years old, I would go down to where the gator was, and we would communicate with each other. I would learn to grunt at him, and he would grunt back. So we started a communication process, and that gator died about a year or so later. My granddaddy fed him scraps from the meat market, and when he died, he was skinned, and my granddaddy noticed that his liver was extremely white. So the gator may have been sick while he was in natural surroundings, or he might have gotten sick while he was in the basement. But he did not live very long there. But he was kind of a famous participant in the life of children in DeLand that knew my grandparents had a gator hide in the garage. And most every little boy in town had gone over, looked at this 14-foot gator hide hanging in the garage. And part of this animal is still out at the fairgrounds, and most of the animal has decomposed over the years.
Well, okay, you said you were a blacksmith as far as your grandfather, right?
Okay, my granddad came into Florida in the early 1900s. He came from Buffalo, New York, after spending about 13 years as a gold miner in Alaska. And my aunt has written a book about his experiences in the Arctic and gold mining experiences. And my mother had a necklace of gold nuggets that my granddad found. And it was lost somewhere along the line. But up until about in the 60s or 70s, she still had that bracelet, necklace. And my granddad had the blacksmith shop, and the positioning of where it was is where Café DaVinci is now. Café DaVinci is the actual spot where the blacksmith existed. We had forges, we had cooling tanks. As we made tempered tools, we would heat the tool steel in the forge. It would be just red as it could be. We would take that little thing that we were working on to temper it. We would heat it, and then we would watch a straw-colored band move down the tool steel towards the end. And the job would be to catch that bronze area, which had more carbon in it than the rest of it. You didn't want too much carbon in the whole thing because it would be brittle and break. You wanted the carbon to be at the very end. So at the very end, you dunk it in the water. And if you did that at exactly the right time, you would have a very small tempered part of this punch or chisel or whatever you were making. So I experienced the business of blacksmithing. I would shoe horses. I would do all the kind of things that you would normally expect of blacksmith.
How old were you when you were doing the
This was in the 13, 14-year-old age.
Okay.
One of my primary jobs as I was doing this, my dad and uncle both had arthritis, and they could not use a sledgehammer. But I was 13 or 14 at the time, and they would get me to do the hitting on the steel. My dad would go to junkyards and get the axles out of Model A's and Model T's, take those axles, put them in the forge, cut them with a torch, and I would hit them and shape it. Now, I did not have any C-hooks in my possession, so last night I decided to make one. And I still have the vise and the anvil that I used back when I was a young man. And the purpose of a C-hook was to help people that were pulling lumber, big logs of cypress, out of the swamp and out of the river when they sank. The C-hook and a long cable was the way in which this process worked. You would have a cable, you would take the C-hook, and then you would wrap it around the log in here, and then you would pull the cable and hook it together with this appliance called a C-hook, and they would be lost all the time because you're working over water, and as you work over water, they would be lost. So we had a constant supply for these items that we made called C-hooks. And that was my primary job in the blacksmith shop when I was young.
Okay, so you grew up during World War II. You were like an early teen, or what do you remember from like that period, like World War II and DeLand? Your family, any things that you did, or?
Well, when the war started and the rationing process took place, we collected tinfoil. We saved the tinfoil. We wrapped it up in a big ball.
And that was real tin back then.
That was real tin back then. Now it's aluminum. And we would save that. We would also save newspapers. We had a kind of a let's reuse things as we were going along. And the process of collecting things was just part of our life. Our primary thing on weekends was to go into the woods and get lighter wood in the wintertime. We had a wood stove. We had a kerosene stove which my mother used to cook on. And we would spend part of our time out in the woods looking for lighter wood, which is the rosinous part of a pine tree that is used for starting fires. And that's how we would spend many weekends, looking for lighter wood, going fishing, catching fish to take home to eat. So we also had a garden. And the situation is we tried to be as self-sufficient as we could. And that was typical of the life as I was growing up.
Yeah, you said you were pretty good with a slingshot, didn't you?
Well, yes, I would take split rubber off of old tires, the tubes of the tires, and put them over the branching of a tree, made a slingshot, used leather to put the back in to hold the projectile that was going to be shot. And we would kill rabbits and squirrels and birds, and Mother would cook them. This would not be a primary item in our diet, but it supplemented what we had to eat. And the other thing that we did, that I did as a child, is we had cattle and horses in Lake County. And we actually have had a cow for many, many years, but then we got into the cattle business later. And during that period of time, I was impacted by the parasites that were damaging the animals. We had a thing called a screwworm fly, and it was called a screwworm fly because the larvae of the screwworm fly looked exactly like the screw I'm holding in my hand. It was about the same size and about the same shape as the screwworm fly larvae. And the larvae would be very, very dangerous to any wound of an animal, including humans. Anytime a mammal was scratched by a barbed wire fence, or anytime a calf was born or a colt, the navel was the vulnerable spot for the screwworm fly to lay her eggs. And the larvae ate live flesh. They could not eat decomposed flesh or rotten flesh. They had to eat live flesh. And they would eat the belly out of that cow by chomping away. The way we dealt with them is we would carry a bucket around with us every time a calf was born or a colt, and throw them on their back, look at their belly, see their navel, and in that navel, you'd see these little screwworm flies, larvae, are just wiggling and just eating their way into that animal's body. So what we did, we had a little bucket, had benzene in it, it's a liquid, and we had a tar called Smerex. And what we would do is we would take a syringe, we would spray in the benzene into that navel, killing all of the live larvae that were there. And then we would cover that area up with a tar called Smerex, and that would keep other screwworm flies from laying their eggs. What the Florida Agriculture Department did is they knew that the female screwworm fly mated only one time. Now, they radiated thousands of male screwworm flies that were grown in captivity, put them in little capsules, flew them up in the air, an airplane, and dropped them all over the state of Florida where there were cattle and horses. And those radiated males could not fertilize the eggs of the female fly. So every egg she laid was sterile. It could not grow. And that's how the screwworm fly was eradicated in the state of Florida. And this was about in the 50s when this was going on. And they had check stations around. So if you were transporting animal from place to place, they could look at the animal and check it out so we wouldn't spread it other places.
So you were responsible for eradicating the screwworm. Right?
I helped in the process, but they did that. And the other thing that we had to be involved in is a thing called the Texas fever tick. And that tick would carry a microorganism that would interfere with a cow's metabolism, and it would cause intense fevers. So what would happen to get rid of those ticks is we had to catch our animals, put them in a trailer, carry them about 10 miles to what they called a dipping vat. Now, the dipping vat was a large concrete hole, and it was narrow, and the cows were put in a corral, or horses, and they were funneled into a very narrow pathway. And in that pathway, the animals that were reluctant to jump into the arsenic bath were pushed in. We would put a 2x4 behind them and one person on each side in the back and just force them in. It's about 8 feet deep where they first went down into the dipping vat. And only about the tip of their ears were the only things that didn't get wet. So any tick that was on that animal would be eradicated. So in the process of dealing with the wildlife in terms of the screwworm fly and the animals that were being raised for food and pleasure, we just had to deal with those two issues.
How often did that dip have to take place?
I think it was about once a month we had to do that.
So everybody that was raising cattle all had to do that?
Everybody that had a horse or a cow. I don't know about sheep and goats. I don't remember seeing any sheep and goats at the dipping vat.
Did any of those cattle ever die from getting arsenic?
Absolutely. Yes. If they swallowed the arsenic, they would actually die. Yes.
Okay, so you had sort of a cattle ranch over in Lake County. That was
yes, right across. It was right on the St. Johns River. It was about 400 acres, and in that ranch we used the wiregrass, which is a highly nutritious grass, as a primary source of food for these animals. And I had a little cow pony that I would use to round them up every time we had to do this. And I would leave school early on those days. I had permission from the principal and the teachers to leave school, and I had to round up all these animals, and we had to put them in a corral, and we had to take them to the dipping vat.
Okay, going back to DeLand again during the war, you said y'all had a cow. Tell us about that.
Well, this cow had kind of a wild attitude. Her name was Baby. She was a Jersey cow, very good milk, but she had an attitude. She was pretty aggressive with the people that owned her before we bought her, and they told us that. So we did not have a pasture, but we had a long chain and a metal stake, and we would take that cow every day, put her in a different place in the woods across from her house, and she would eat the grass. And then we'd bring her home in the evening, and we had to milk her, and we'd get the the milk from her, and my brother and I would milk her at the same time. He'd be on one side, I'd be on the other side, and we could take a gallon jug with a narrow neck and not miss a drop. We would take that process and that in that milk that we would get, we would drink the milk, but we would also make butter. So we had a churn, and every Saturday morning we would go in, get the milk, take the churn, listen to Let's Pretend on the radio, and make butter. Now, instead of throwing the milk away in which the butter was removed, we would let it ferment, and it would make a substance called clabber. I did not like clabber, but my dad did. So we used that clabber he did to supplement his diet.
Yeah, you mentioned old Model T axles, and you mentioned keeping the clabber. You feel like back in that time, people sort of tried to use things and not just toss them like we do today?
We really didn't have a choice. We just had to use what we had and go on with it.
You mentioned the attitude of the cow. What about that?
Well, one day we were taking her out to pasture, and she ran at me, and had my slingshot in my pocket, and she came running at me, and my dad intended for me to use the slingshot to just flip her in the nose with the rubber band and stop her. Well, he didn't know I had a marble that I thought I was supposed to use. So I had this marble in my slingshot, and she came running at me. I hit her between the eyes with this marble. She fell to her knees. She never chased me anymore.
Okay. So what about that milk? How'd you refrigerate it? Did y'all have an electric refrigerator?
No refrigerator. We had an ice box, and the iceman would come periodically to keep us supplied with ice.
Was that true of a lot of people?
That's everybody I knew.
Yeah. How do you think, thinking about DeLand back in those days compared to today, what changes? Have you seen any major changes? Or
Yeah, I've seen many, many changes. In my early development, we lived in a very segregated community. We seldom saw Black people in the stores. We seldom saw Black people around mingling as they do today. It was pretty much a highly restricted zone, which everybody understood where we should be. The Black community had 3 major communities here. One that is between where Stetson is and the old Boston Avenue School on Ohio Avenue had a small section called Red City. And Red City now has been pretty much bought out by Stetson, and as it has expanded. The other area, which is still pretty much involved as a community, is Dunn Bottom, and that's out east of DeLand on Forest Avenue. The primary center of the Black community was Spring Hill, which is on the western side of DeLand. And in that community, there was a Black man named Johnny McArthur. And Johnny McArthur was probably the most outstanding horseman in this entire area. He was not a fake cowboy. He was the real McCoy. He could ride horses that nobody else could ride. He wore a cowboy hat and had a reputation in the Black community. Do not mess with Johnny McArthur, because he could clean your clock. So he had that reputation. He was
sort of the law in town.
He was sort of the one that kind of kept people safe, straight. Because Johnny McArthur was such an expert horseman, cowboy, he and my uncle became friends. And when we had a Christmas parade in DeLand, which was one of the highlights of our year, because we would have a parade and the Black students from Euclid Avenue and the white students from DeLand High School would be in the band. And that's about the only time we would see groups of Black children, is Christmas time. And this man, Johnny, was asked or volunteered to ride this big stallion that my uncle had. His name was Pal, and Pal was a big, beautiful Arabian Stallion. And I want you to picture this. Here we are in a very segregated community. We have a Christmas parade, and we have a Black cowboy riding this giant white horse that would get up on its feet, dance side to side, going down the Boulevard in the 40s. Wow. That was a pretty spectacular sight.
A tradition.
Yes.
Speaking of downtown, the Woodland Boulevard, the trees and all, tell me about that.
Okay.
Talking about that.
There has been a transition in the vegetation in Volusia County. There's a process called ecological succession in which one plant community, which was the old pine trees, longleaf pine trees, growing all around DeLand at the time. There are very few of these left. There are a few at Stetson that you can see on the grounds of Stetson today. And it was a pretty open kind of environment. But over the years, the community of the longleaf pine Turkey Oak Association has gradually been replaced with a thing called a mesic hammock. And the mesic hammock is having the laurel oak and a lot of other trees that shaded the bottom of this pine tree environment. So what happened over the period of time in DeLand is that the pine tree area was replaced, and as lightning and disease killed the major pine trees, the oak trees merged into that environment, and that community of plants completely changed in my lifetime. And now the oak environment is the dominant.
What about the laurel oak you were talking about?
Okay, the laurel oak, which many people call the water oak, is a very fast-growing shade tree. The sides of the Boulevard in DeLand were covered with shade from these laurel oaks that were planted. They got very big. They would have a diameter of 3 feet sometimes, really big trees. But their lifespan was not as long as the live oak, which is a more permanent type of plant. In every area where there was a branch, where there's a V, anytime there was a wind shift that was able to move the limbs, and there was a tiny crack made between the two branches of the laurel oak, a virus would get into those cracks and completely eat the tree from the inside out. So all of these laurel oaks were subjected to that, and they became dangerous. So they were eventually either hauled away as their branches died, or they were cut off.
When did that period happen? Like
that was in the 40s.
40s and 50s.
Yeah, 40s.
And they replanted live oaks.
They learned that later, that if you use the live oak, it's a slower growing oak, but it is more durable.
Okay, well, what about your, you have children?
I have one child that is a manager of a Walgreens store in Tampa. His name is Mark. He went to university and got a degree in communications. And
I taught him in high school.
Yes. He was on the basketball team when he was at high school and was very competitive. And then I have Debbie, who's my next child, and she works at Amelia Liquors. And then Michael lives in a trailer next to me, and he does yard work.
Okay, Al, what schools did you go to in DeLand, and can you reflect a little bit on what school was like back then compared to today? I mean, so maybe discipline, was it different? Did they have lunch served at school? No air conditioning? What do you remember?
My first experience with school was at Boston Avenue School. We lived about 3 blocks from the school. And when I started first grade, when I was 5, I went to school. I don't remember the story about the lunches. I think we either took a lunch, but I don't remember a scheduled program for lunch. But we basically had the same teachers in a school. We had very little changeover. They kind of worked until they got too old and retired. So I got to see my teachers a long time. One of my teachers was Miss Campbell, and Miss Campbell was a cousin to Walt Disney. And when Miss Campbell died, I was asked to help bury her over in a little cemetery in Paisley. And that was an interesting experience. But that was my only contact with one of my former teachers.
Okay. Did you play sports in school?
Yeah, I was on the track team. I ran the mile. And I was a basketball player, played guard.
Tell us about your college experience, because you weren't planning on going to college like a lot of people back then.
Well, when I graduated from high school, before I graduated from high school, a gentleman walked into our machine shop, and my dad was there, and this gentleman's name was Dr. J. Harrison Griffin. And J. Harrison Griffin was a Baptist minister. And he saw me doing things around the barber shop, the machine shop. And in watching me, he liked something he saw about me. And he asked my dad what I was going to do when I graduated from high school. My dad said, he's probably going to go to the service. He's going to work here in the machine shop. He said, if he wants to go to college, I'd be interested in helping him. And he had a source of money from the Hershey chocolate family, the Hershey chocolate candy making place. And he said, I can help him go to college. And my granddad decided that he would go ahead and match what Dr. J. Harrison Griffin had offered me. So I was able to go to Stetson University because he liked me. And he used to ask me to come over to his house and help him once in a while, or I offered to help him with the yard work and things, because he started a very important aspect of my life by giving me this opportunity. Seems like I have a guardian angel, because not only did that happen, but while I was going to Stetson, the professors there wanted me to be in charge of the lab assistants that each biology teacher had. And I had to get the materials ready for them so that those teachers could have the access to that. So they offered me a fellowship that paid me to get my master's degree. So that was another of my guardian angel.
What was Stetson like back then? Did you have to go to chapel every day?
Oh, yes. Stetson was a Baptist sponsored university. And when I took religion, my professor's name was Dr. Angel. He was one of the religion professors there. And it was an interesting place. I did not live in a dorm when I went to Stetson. I lived at home. So I was able to join a fraternity. I joined the Sigma Nu fraternity. And at Stetson, it had most of the football players, and it was a good fraternity. One of my fraternity brothers was Bill Watson. Bill Watson has a very large real estate business in the state of Florida, and
what did you major in Stetson?
Well, I had a major in biology, and I had minors in history and psychology.
So what happened after college? How did you get into the education thing? And was there anything else you did before? You mentioned something about in between bachelor and master's degree.
Okay. One of my learning experiences with the University of Florida, University of Florida has several areas called experiment stations. And in Lake Alfred, they had an experiment station that was basically related to citrus. In Sanford, they had a concentration on truck crops, tomatoes, cabbage, all the things that you think of as going to the vegetable department. Celery. The kids that went to Sanford High School had a very unusual name. They were called the Celery Feds. The reason for that is that Sanford was the celery capital of the world at that time. Now, in that process of growing the celery, the farmers would use a copper-based spray to control the insects that were destroying the celery. Now, the way they did that was they just sprayed and sprayed and sprayed. Sometimes we don't know what harmful effects are going to be as a result of some of the things we do to solve a problem. We sometimes create a bigger problem. Now, the bigger problem we created with the spraying of the celery with the copper-based spray was we ruined the soil. What happened is that the copper messes up the iron entrance into the process of a healthy plant. So to get the ground healthy and allow plants to pick up the iron that they needed to grow into healthy plants, one of my bosses was an agronomist who was a soil specialist, and his job was to figure out how to remove the copper so the soil can be used again. Now, he could do that, but it was cost prohibitive. It was not a practical way, but that's what his job was. My other boss was a horticulturist, and he did plant development. And outside of our office in Sanford, we had major areas of vegetable growth. And we also had a little area where we had a section where people could come and look and see what kind of grass they'd like. We had every kind of lawn grass growing in a different patch, so people could come there and look. We also had people that would hybridize tomatoes, watermelons, everything like that. And it was a great experience for me to involve myself in that process. My primary job there was a soil technician. And what that meant is people would bring a soil sample in. They would bring it to me. I had machines there that were all electronic. And one of my jobs was to measure the conductivity of the soil. And that conductivity was related to the kind of minerals that were there that would transmit electrical current. So you could tell how much humus and growth elements related to the plant by running it through this little machine. So it measured the conductivity of the soil, and that's how you determine whether the state of the soil in terms of a growing medium.
Okay, so what about your career? A boy who never thought he would ever go to college. You graduate from Stetson. So where did you head to after that?
Well, I went to, I wanted to be a game biologist. I like wildlife, and that's one of the reasons I majored in biology. But I found out that you got transferred from place to place, and I kind of lost interest in that pursuit. And the other thing that I had done while I was going, I wanted to get a education background so I could be a teacher. So I went through all the processes of taking education courses, internship at Seabury Senior High School, and I went through those processes, and then I decided to be an educator. The job that was open was at Mainland High School when it was in a very different place than it is now. It was on 3rd Street in Daytona Beach, and it was an old wooden dilapidated building. My first job there, well, let me go back to the interview for the job. When I interviewed for the job, I went to the school board to see where they had some vacancies, and there was a vacancy at Mainland. And so I went over and talked to Mr. Welshinger, who was principal at the time. And there's a road on the LPGA highway that goes into the stadium on this same highway. Saw it yesterday, Welshinger Avenue. He was a very popular and wonderful principal. But when he was going to Stetson, he played football. He was from Wisconsin. And on holidays like Thanksgiving and Christmas, it was hard for him to get home. And being a football player, he got to know people because he could still stay at Stetson, but he didn't have any place to go to be on those holidays. So my granddaddy, who was a groundskeeper at Stetson, he was affectionately known as Shorty Burge, which was my mother's family maiden name, would invite him to the house out on Anita Street, north of town, and he'd have him for meals and give him a place to socialize. So when I had after the interview, Mr. Welshinger said, "When you told me you were related to Shorty Burge, you had the job." So that was kind of an interesting experience there.
Another guiding angel.
Yeah. And my first job of teaching was a very, very interesting challenge that most teachers don't have to deal with. I taught civics, American history, and general science.
Interesting mix.
That's an interesting mix. And not only was that an interesting mix, I had to change classrooms every period because I was there when the teachers had their planning period. And not only did I have to change rooms, I had to change buildings to go from one place to another. So
you discovered why there's a vacancy.
Yeah, no, this was a real good experience for me. I enjoyed the kids. One of my students was Frank Woods. He was not really a student. He was in my homeroom. And Frank Woods owned Comfort Service air conditioning in DeLand. And I see Frank from time to time. And Frank went to Georgia Tech and became an engineer. I saw him recently, and he said, "My daughter's going to be a principal." And she went to schools in DeLand, and she's going to be a principal.
So how long were you at Mainland?
I was there about 13 years. I went there first as a teacher. And after that first year, all of my classes were general science classes. And then when we opened the new Mainland up, at that time was on where the present Mainland is, they tore that whole, we built the new Mainland there, and then it was torn down and a new Mainland is built there. So the process of that was just very interesting.
So you were there at Mainland when some black students were brought in during the integration times. Is that right? Or
Yes.
Tell us about how that happened and what you remember about that.
My first two students that were black were both very bright children. Dee Dee Golden was a young black girl that went through my classes, and Homer Ryan was a young man that was very, very bright, and he ended up becoming a doctor. and I think he's a doctor in Daytona. But there was no friction at all. There were some problems when the schools were integrated. The conflict between blacks and whites created a little problem for a while, and we worked through that. And but that happened a lot when we were going through that integration process.
Okay, later you were tapped to go to Stark. Tell us about that.
Well, after my first mainland experience, I was asked to go into a new program, and it was a Title I program, and it was called the Variable Instructional Service Program. And the county developed a crew of teachers that they selected, black and white, to be model teachers for resource for teachers that needed to have a little boost. And I was the chairman of that group. And I got to go around teaching at many high schools, black and white, and do science work, demonstration science teaching. So that was a lot of fun.
What stands out as your most memorable experience, or the best time in your life that you can think of?
Well,
you mentioned travel.
Today, my wife and I love to travel. We've been to Hawaii. We've been to the Rocky Mountains in Canada. She's been to Russia. She's been to tours in Europe. I've not been involved in those. And we have an interesting relations. We have a we have a me and her. And we kind of share we have independent lives and united lives.
You mentioned something about electric welding that impressed you. What was that?
Well,
and when was that?
Okay, as we go back to my grandfather's way of welding, it was called heat welding. He would take two pieces of metal, put them together after they were red hot, and kind of melt them together. And this was a process of the heat welding, that the forge, and that's the way that worked. Well, the transition of the forge, which is used for the fabrication of metal products, changed to the electric welder. The electric welder was a phenomenal instrument in the preparation of war equipment and in the war. Mm. And so the transition from the blacksmith shop to the machine shop involved two kinds of welding. We had what is called the acetylene welder, which used oxygen and acetylene. We made our own acetylene. We got calcium carbide in great big containers, and we would put it in a big hopper that was on top of some water that we filled up in this big tank. You had to roll it around, and it made the acetylene. Now, you can buy acetylene in a tank and oxygen in a tank. So we would buy the oxygen and even sell it. We were a distributor of oxygen. And one of my jobs as that worker in that business was if a person like had TB and they needed oxygen, I would deliver the oxygen to the home in which it was needed. And the other thing that we did, and back to the machine shop, is we had people coming into the machine shop all the time asking if they could get some of the debris from our metal grinder. You put your metal there, the grinding machine would make a pile of this metal dust. People would come in and ask for it. they would take it home and mix it so they could eat it to get iron for their bodies.
Wow.
This was a source of iron for people before they had iron pills. The other thing was the byproduct of us making the acetylene was whitewash. And if you've ever heard the term whitewash fence, it's the material that's left after you've made the acetylene in the tank. So we had to take the tank across the street, put it in a big ditch. People would come in and get that whitewash to paint their fences. So there were some byproducts of our business that were pretty useful.
You've had a lot of experience. What advice would you give to young people today?
Well, young people today in our generation have created a very serious problem between us. Because in the 50s, we had this thing happen. We had a cultural shift in our country. And instead of becoming a goal-oriented society, which is, I'm going to follow a very direct path to make my life better in the future, about that time, the hippie movement started. And people began to see, hey, this goal-oriented society isn't for me. Let's have some fun on the way up. In fact, it got to a point where they were just having fun, not going up. But anyway, the problem today is this shift has caused a rift between children and parents. And we do not have the same level of discipline that we had. The children have, a lot of children have kind of, this role-oriented society gets you in trouble sometimes. So we have a lot of young people that are dealing with those problems with drugs. So the situation with that shift is that if I had to recommend something for a young person, is to do two things: enjoy your life while you're here, but also prepare for the future. So what I've tried to do there is to blend those two things.
Sort of a balance.
Sort of a balance.
We're kind of out of balance.
That's right.
Yeah. You lived in DeLand all your life, pretty much.
Period.
So, period. Okay. So, what is it about DeLand that you love?
DeLand was a very quiet, entertaining environment for me to live. We had the academic aspect of DeLand with the university. There's some interesting stories about why DeLand is called the Athens of Florida. One of them is we're surrounded by 7 hills. The other one is we were the academic focal point for Central Florida because of Stetson. So those two things were involved in that.
Okay, one last question. How would you like to be remembered?
Probably the most driving force in my life in value judgment is fairness. And I think that is probably my highest thing that I treasure, is that I can be fair. I try to be fair.
Thank you, Al. It was good talking to you today.
Thank you, Stan. Enjoyed being here.